So as Emily said, I'm going to talk about geography and the 2020 census. This will be a really quick view. So hopefully I'll hit, well, I'm planning to hit kind of the highlights on how geography is the cornerstone of the decennial census. From the beginning, so actually, well, those who know what happens at the Census Bureau know that we actually start planning the census like 10 or 11 or 12 years in advance. So while this is Census 2020 day, we've actually already started planning for the 2030 census, and I'm on that group or have been part of that group. So that seems kind of weird. But geography divisions work when you actually get into the real thing of conducting census operations. Geography divisions work starts really early in the decade, and with the first piece of establishing where we count. So we maintain the master address file, the address list that all of the Census Bureau uses for conducting the census, for surveys and so forth. So we've been constantly keeping that up to date over the course of the decade. I'll say a little bit about that. Then we follow through into conducting the enumeration. So we define this map that's here, shows the types of enumeration areas. So I think probably most everybody on this session is in this, what we call the self-response part of the country. So you would have gotten something in the mail, tell you how to go online, respond online. Eventually, if you don't want to do it online, eventually you'll get a paper questionnaire delivered to your mailbox. But you can see in this map, these tan areas are where we still kind of do things traditionally, where we go around door to door and drop off materials. And these are in the areas where we really don't have good spatial locations for addresses. So we need to send enumerators out, drop off the materials, record the address, record the spatial location. And then that helps us with tabulation and dissemination of data. So geography division is busy from well before others at the Bureau are starting on their operations. We're busy through the enumeration as data are coming in and as we're prepping the geography for tabulation. And then we keep going into the years after the census. And I can remember sitting in a meeting in 2011 and a bunch of people saying, yay, we're done. And I said, I've still got 2 years of spatial data products to ship out. So geography's there at all elements, all sides, all parts of the census. So I'll say a little bit about maintaining our address list. This decade, we've really focused on the in-office processes. So maintaining the addresses through processing a wide variety of sources, and then also using imagery and an in-office approach to detecting change on the ground. I'll show that in just a minute. The Postal Service's files are our primary source. We brought in about almost 6 million new residential addresses from the Postal Service files this decade. An additional 2.4 million addresses that were new to the Postal Service file were already in our address list. New for this decade, we were partnering with tribal, state, and local governments to acquire their address files, and you can see the numbers there. A lot of that duplicated what we had coming in from the Postal Service. And then the other address update program that we run is called Local Updated Census Addresses, and that's where local governments get to see our actual address list, the individual addresses. Our address list is confidential. So what we do for the LUCA program is we swear in somebody at the local government level. They can view the actual list. They can make whatever changes are necessary. They can tell us what's correct. So what we did in the office this decade, instead of sending new, address canvassers down every single road in the country to check the address list like we did in 2010, we used an in-office approach where we were comparing change through 2 vintages of imagery. This is just a still shot of the application that the clerks would have been using. They would have swiped back and forth to detect change in the image, detect changes in housing, and then compare that count of rooftops to the count of addresses in the master address file, and then record whether there was over coverage or under coverage. And then that would get shipped off to groups that would monitor and analyze and see if we were, through our address process, the processing of files, if we were keeping up with change or fixing the coverage errors, and then eventually setting the address list for the portion that would actually go out to the field for in-field address canvassing. Now, these two maps just kind of show the results of the in-office approach, the in-office analysis at the end of March of 2019, right before we cut the list for the field work. The dark on the left-hand side, you've got the percentage of addresses in blocks that are passive. So those were blocks where everything was fine, the address list was good. So the darker the blue, the better the address list. The lighter shading, which corresponds to the darker green on the map on the right, is where we had more coverage issues. And so you can see very clearly the South had quite a few issues with address coverage, or we had quite a few issues with address coverage in the master address file for the South. And that's partly a reflection of the high rates of growth that have occurred in the South. And it's also a reflection of kind of inability of local governments to keep up with their address files. So they're not shipping us good, complete address lists. And we also had a fair amount of junk in our file that's causing coverage issues. So in August to October of 2019, we conducted in-field address canvassing. So we sent people out to canvass about 35% of all of the addresses in the country. Again, on the previous slide, it's mostly in those areas in the map of active blocks. It's in the areas that have the darker greens. And most of the work was in those. What we found, so about 50 million addresses were sent out for a field check, and about 44.1 million of them were validated by field work, so 88%. So again, these were blocks where we weren't entirely certain that we had a good, accurate address list, so field work was necessary to establish that certainty. And we actually found that quite a few of those addresses, the large proportion of those addresses, were very good. What the canvassers found was almost 2.7 million new addresses. So that is, they were new to the list. They weren't on the list that they had in hand. But 57% of those matched to addresses that we had acquired through other processes that summer and while they were out in the field. So I think that just one of the things we've learned this decade is that the digital files that exist, the digital address lists that exist around the country are excellent. They're great sources of information. We can manage a lot of the update and analysis of data in the office, and we can really limit the amount of field work that's necessary. Moving on to conducting the enumeration, I've just got one slide here to kind of tie in with that. Our cartographers worked with statisticians to put together the response outreach area mapper. And this shows the areas that have an expected low response score. So it's tract level data. It's got a lot of American Community Survey data in there as well. But the primary purpose was to help us and help our partners at the local level understand where populations are that might have a tendency not to respond to the census. And then we can target outreach to those localities. Oh, and then so you can see, we'll just zoom in on a bit of New York here, and then you can see the data. This particular tract in Brooklyn has a low response score of 35.6, and you can see the characteristics of the population in that area. And then moving into kind of where we're at today, we're in the process of finalizing the tabulation geography for the 2020 census. So geographers are hard at work. I should mention we've got about 200 geographers on our staff in geography division, and they're hard at work finalizing the geographies. They incorporated the political geography, so incorporated places, towns, townships, and so forth. They've been coming in on the boundary and annexation survey. We're finalizing the statistical geography that we collect when working with local planners. If you're familiar, if you kind of know the numbers, there were about 74,000 tracts in the US and Puerto Rico for the 2010 census. and now we're up to almost a little over 85,000 tracts. So tracts split if the population grows, and you can see the block group and the block numbers. We're actually reducing the number of census blocks. They were at 11.1 million in 2010. We're back to about 8 million. And if we were at local 16, we would be right about here in tract 4201, right about there actually. There's 16th Street. And what I thought I'd show here is just a few of the tracts in DC around local 16 that have split from, that have changed from 2010. So tracts 37, 38, 44, you can see here in 2010, and they've now split due to population growth. There's U Street right there. That is now the boundary between tracts 44.01 and 44.02. And you can see where the other splits are: Calorama Road, Euclid Street. So changes to geography that we all have to get used to. And then what happens after 2020? So we're not done with the geography. When we finish up the work this summer, we'll update the zip code tabulation areas later in the year. Then next year, we'll delineate the public use microdata areas with the state data centers. We'll define the urban areas based on 2020 census data. And then Tom's colleagues in population division will define the metro and metropolitan and micropolitan areas. And so there's still geography work that occurs after the actual census is done. And then we stop. We take like an afternoon break, and then we get to work on the geography for the upcoming decade, because it's always changing. So thanks.
Woo!
Cool.
That was very quick.
Yeah, that was awesome. We got a couple questions in our Zoom chat if you want to answer those. The first one comes from Matthew. He was wondering, how well does the in-house stuff work versus the old way of doing things?
Oh, much, much better. So think about your address and all the ways that it could possibly be written and or screwed up. And so field workers tend to do that sometimes. Not every field worker has good spatial skills, so we get all kinds of crazy stuff coming in from the field. What we find is that the in-office approaches are much more accurate. The geographers who are reviewing the data in the office have a lot more materials and resources at their fingertips. They can go online, check online parcel data from the local governments. We're finding it's just faster, and the accuracy rates are just that much higher. And so what we can do, what this allows us to do then, is focus the field work in areas where there aren't good source materials, where the only way to be certain is to actually be on the ground.
Okay, we've got another question from Dave. Is there still some way that the location or the geocode portion of MAF can still be shared?
No. So both the address and the lat long are confidential. But one of the things that's come out of this decade's work is a lot of increased interest and increased recognition in the value of making that address list and the locational data public. So we're not allowed to lobby Congress as a federal agency, but others can. So it would be a good thing if you would find that valuable. It'd be a good thing to let your congressional representatives know. The Government Accountability Office, in some of one of their more recent studies of where they reviewed the local updated census addresses, they came like really close to making that recommendation that the address list be public. They basically talked all around the value of releasing the address list. And so if lawmakers don't understand the value, they just don't understand what GAO was writing. The other thing that's happening is there's development of a national address database. Department of Transportation is taking the lead. Census Bureau we're working with them as advisors and experts in addressing. Eventually somebody's going to wake up to the fact that the government is maintaining or building and maintaining two separate address lists, one for the public and one that's internal to the Census Bureau. And so eventually somebody's going to figure that out and say, wait, we only need one. Make the full complete one public.
All right, I think maybe we have time for one more. I know there's a lot of really good questions in this chat, so we'll ask one more kind of generic-y one. When will the 2020 block geography and population be available?
Oh, the geography will be available in late November, early December of 2020. So we'll release the Tiger Line files. Look for them early December. So we get the spatial data out before the redistricting data files are released. The population data will then start flowing out in January, I think mid to late January, February. We don't have time to talk about this, but if you haven't heard about differential privacy, go educate yourselves. The Census Bureau is adopting differentially private methods to protect confidentiality. Basically what that means is we will be injecting noise into the data to make it virtually impossible for you to, or for anybody to mash up large amounts of data sets with supercomputers and tease out the identity of an individual. Maybe that's another GeoDC talk.
This is Tom. I will second that. As data users, you really want to know about differential privacy because it could have huge implications for how you use your data, and you should read up on it.
Yeah, so Tom, why don't we do that as a later meetup, maybe in the summer. I'm working with the math stats on that, on the modified geographic hierarchy to help improve the accuracy of things. So a lot more we could say about that.
Mike, I'm glad you're on the spine. That's all I got to say.
I am the census chiropractor now. I am working on the geographic spine.
All right, that's some insider jokes there. We'll stop that now.
All right, wow, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.